Hi there, my name's Annette with Sunbeam Fabric Art. Welcome to my channel. Today I've got some beautiful 10-inch squares in green and blue batiks, and I'm going to turn those into a baby quilt. This brand was Island Batiks, and the first thing I need to do is press all these creases. With all those pressed, I'm going to be pairing up a 10-inch square of white with a 10-inch square of my batik fabric. You can stack them up as high as you feel comfortable cutting. I stacked mine 6 in a stack. Now I am using a Drunkard's Path template, and it is really designed for 10-inch squares. I'm only using half of the template here today, and the reason I'm doing that, I want to show you that you don't have to have a template to cut on a curve and sew things back together on a curve. I have even made quilts where I just cut the curve freeform without a template at all. Now it's time to do a little mix and match. I'm going to pair a piece of white inner circle with a piece of color outer circle and vice versa. I like to stitch mine together with the inner circle on the bottom and the outer circle on the top. And what I find works for me is that I overlap about 1/4 of an inch where I start. I don't mark the center of my circles. I just start about 1/4 of an inch overlap on that top piece, and I just ease that curve together little by little, sewing about 1 inch at a time, and then moving the fabric a little bit to the left and a little bit to the left each time to follow that inner curve. And once I get to the end of this, I will fold this open so you can see what it looks like, and they press flat very nicely. It's pretty easy just to take this to the iron and press it flat. I like to start in the center of the curve and then work my way to the outside of the curve. I'm going to be trimming all my blocks down to the same size. In this case, 9 inches is looking pretty good to me. But first we need to stitch the rest of these curves together. I ran into one little cutting mistake. I went ahead and when I stitched that top curve to this, I just moved it over a little bit there, and it actually did end up okay because it did trim to 9 inches square. I continued stitching all these curves together. When I got them all stitched together, I took my stack to the iron and pressed all those curves flat. When it was time to start trimming these, I always place my 90-degree corner in the lower left to start with. Line that up with my 9-inch mark on the ruler and trim off the top and the right-hand side. Then I flip the block around and trim off the other 2 sides just to make sure everything's nice and straight. In real life, not every square that you think is supposed to be square is actually square, so make adjustments as you need to. Once I had all my blocks trimmed to 9 inches, I started laying these out on my floor to see what kind of layout I wanted to make. Once I had everything just like I wanted, I picked these rows up row by row so I could take them to the sewing machine and hopefully keep them in the proper order. Now it was just a matter of chain piecing my entire stack of blocks. And I made sure the clips for each row stayed on the leftmost block for each row. Once I had 2 blocks attached, it was time to go back through the stack, put 2 together with 2 more to make 4. Now once I had 4 together, that tail end was long enough to swing around and add on the next 2 blocks. And then I was able to swing that tail around and add on the last 2 blocks for this row. This layout is pretty easy because it doesn't require matching. Now I've got row 1 complete, and I'm going to do the rest of the rows. Just a little cautionary tale, when you're using batiks, it's hard to tell which is the wrong side and which is the right side, and it's easy to make a mistake like this. Now, for this layout to look the way I want it, I really do need to pay attention and make sure I'm getting these blocks lined up properly. So you can see I've got this whole row laid out all the way across my table. I could also do this back on the floor. That might even be easier, just to put it back on my floor and then pick up 2 rows at a time. But it seemed to work out okay for me by just doing this on top of the table, double checking my rows, making sure that the pattern looked right as I laid these 2 rows down together. Now again, the only thing that has to match when I stitch these 2 rows together are the individual blocks. And you can see here I'm nesting that seam, I'm putting a clip in it, I've got one seam going one way, one seam going the other way. Once I make it to the end of the row, clipping the seams together, I double check that my row clips that tell me what row I'm on are still in the right place. So that's row 5 on the top and row 6 on the bottom. Then I feel comfortable going ahead and stitching these 2 rows together. I stitched row 3 and 4 together, then I stitched row 1 and 2 together, and then it was time to join these rows into the finished quilt top. Here you can see I'm not using clips at this time. I just thought these blocks, they were all 9 inches, so they did line up pretty nicely. I was able to match these seams on my own without clips. But as the project gets a little heavier, you may want to use clips or pins to hold everything together. I'll leave a link in the description to a couple of videos that I've done just on finishing the quilt. Here I've skipped ahead and I have pin basted this quilt. I've got backing and batting and the top making my quilt sandwich, and I have used nice large curved basting pins to hold it all together. Since I'm quilting this myself on my home domestic machine, I don't need an extra 4 inches of batting or backing. Just an inch or so is all I need. I took some scrap fabric and I tested out some stitching, some of my decorative stitches on my machine. Some of them look pretty cute, and I just picked a few to use on stitching this quilt top. And you'll notice I'm using black thread. I wanted something a little bit dramatic for this particular quilt and the recipients. I didn't think we needed to worry about hiding the stitching. I wanted it to be bold and stand out. Now it became a matter of just muscling this quilt through my machine and doing the stitching in the way I wanted to do it. The first thing I did was stitch vertical lines on every seam line going one direction. Once I had all the straight lines done, I started on my more challenging idea. I decided to echo the curves on these blocks with decorative stitching, very close to the curve, but not right on top of it. I use lots of different stitches. This one I'm about to show you right now, that is my favorite one, the little squares. And there's a cute little stitch on my machine that has little flowers, which is adorable. I continued stitching these decorative stitches just wherever I felt like they were needed and didn't worry too much about whether it was perfect or going in a perfect direction. Sometimes I had to stitch down over the colored fabric as well. Once I got all that stitching done, I did take a lot of time trimming off all the excess threads from both the front and the back of this quilt. Next, I squared up all 4 sides. Because I used black decorative stitching, I wanted to use black for the binding, so I simply got some 2.5-inch strips, joined those together to make my binding. Once I had all my strips stitched together, I separated the strips and cut off those extra triangles. Then I pressed the seams flat. I folded the 2.5-inch strip in half and pressed that seam as well. To start my binding, I like to make a little pocket by folding down a corner of the leading edge, and then I fold that back in half. It makes a little pocket, and I'm going to tuck the tail end of the binding into that when I get all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and pin down that little pocket I made to the back of the quilt. I don't want to start sewing right on the pocket. I'm going to wait till I get all the way around before I finish stitching down that pocket I made. I'm going to start stitching this to the back of my quilt now, and I'm using about a 3/8-inch seam. Test it out with the, try different widths of binding. Some people like 2 1/4, some people like even smaller, but I like 2 1/2 folded in half, but then I use a 3/8-inch seam, and that is what works best for me. When I get to the corner, I stitch off to the corner when I'm a 1/4 inch away from the edge. And then I'm going to turn my fabric diagonally, stitch off the corner, Then I flip my fabric up, my binding up at a 45-degree angle, so it's even with the edge of my quilt. And then I fold it back down upon itself so that top edge is even with the top edge of binding. And then I start stitching from the edge. Once I make it all the way around the quilt, I'm going to cut off my binding at the exact same angle as my pocket, leaving enough overlap to tuck in. I changed out my pins here to the ones I should have used at the beginning. And here you see I'm just tucking that little extra tail into that little pocket that I made. Now that I've made it all the way around on the quilt back, I'm going to be turning this binding to the front and stitching it down to the front. Now many people will stitch their binding to the front of the quilt, then they will flip it to the back, press it nice and flat, and then hand stitch that binding so that that thread does not show. For this quilt, I am machine stitching it down, and I'm using a blanket stitch. And that way, the extra black thread on the back of the quilt that's going to show, it's going to look intentional. It's going to look like I planned it that way, which I kind of did. Here's a look at how this stitching looks on the back of my quilt. If you like what you see here, I invite you to subscribe to my channel and hit that bell icon. You'll get notified when I post new content. This quilt turned out so cute. I really like it, and I had so much fun playing with the black thread decorative stitching. As of today, the quilt has been washed, dried, and gifted. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I hope to see you back again real soon.